Well, okay, very well. So, Andrej, do you have slides? If yes, then I would
Yes,
like
we
you to
we
share
have
them.
slides, and I present together with Carme Arcarazo, and she will start when I'm able to show you our slides. Can you see something?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Andrej. Yeah, so today we will present basically a working paper that was, well, a report that was asked by the European Parliament, both to La Hidra, the Research Institute La Hidra in Barcelona, from which Jaime Palomera and I represent, and then also along with the Humboldt University, from which Andrej and Jana belong to. So yeah, you can go to the next slide.
You can press Ctrl L in order to maximize the slides to the full screen.
Okay, so to give you a bit of context, background, and sort of purpose of the research, basically, while rent control policies are gaining support across Europe, many economists, think tanks, and like real estate lobbies are opposing them. It is argued that these measures make housing problems worse in the long run, and some even describe them as, in an apocalyptic fashion, as destructive for cities. However, most of the reports and papers that are currently being published are partial and reductionist. First, they adopt an economistic approach, so therefore giving disproportionate weight to the so-called undesired effects that certain forms of rent control allegedly have on the quality and quantity of housing. Therefore, they systematically sort of overlook many of the economic and social consequences of rent control policies. Second, they often offer monocausal explanations, so therefore often ignoring many of the other policies that have an impact on the affordability and accessibility of housing. And in the third place, their general arguments on the ills of rent regulations are more often than not backed by opinion rather than empirical evidence, which is actually very scarce. Therefore, if we want to actually understand rent control and its potential consequences for citizens across Europe, we need to go a bit beyond the limitations of such approaches. And basically, in the report we are working on, we will draw, it's a working paper, so we will draw from a rich and interdisciplinary variety of sources in order to produce a more comprehensible overview of this type of policy and its variegated effects. We will take into account the different existing publications, of course, in the discipline of economics, those that adhere to consensus and also those that do not, but also those produced within the broader field of social sciences and urban studies, including reports by institutional actors in cities with practical experience, all of which are usually like disregarded. And basically the aim is to provide an overview of the different kinds of regulations that have been implemented historically and up to the present time, taking into account different contexts and looking at multiple aspects, no? But basically our hypothesis right now is that if adequately implemented and combined with other instruments, rent control has positive social and urban consequences. Yeah, the structure of the research is going to be the following. So first, it's going to give a context, and the report will basically give an overview of the policies other than rent control that have an impact on housing prices and are often disregarded. So basically, we will show how supply and demand are shaped by regulatory instruments of all kinds, as well as social and cultural factors. Secondly, we will talk about the different types of rent control. We will summarize the different effects and generations of rent control implemented in Europe and North America since the post-war years, looking at the relation with other regulations in their different contexts. But the report will also analyze the impacts of the rent decontrol policies since the 1980s, especially in the US and in several European countries, and their impact on housing affordability. So we will basically look at how the rollback of rent regulations came hand in hand with a series of policies that have increased prices dramatically over the last decade, decoupling them basically from household incomes. And finally, the current forms of rent control will be mapped. We will also talk about the effects of rent control, and I'm sure Andrej after me is gonna go deep into that. But basically, as I said before, through an interdisciplinary revision of the existing literature, we will summarize the effects of the different instruments that have been historically used, including those that are still in place. And based on the available data, the report will try to assess the consequences that rent control, in combination, of course, with other policies, can have on the evolution of rental prices and affordability. But we will not only look at rental prices and affordability, but we also want to focus on other dimensions. So the rate of evictions, social health, well-being, process of gentrification or social cohesion, and the supply of affordable housing. And finally, the report will also include some conclusions and especially political recommendations to draw a series of guidelines. And Andrej, you can go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Carme. I try to present the very first findings in our work in progress studies and to show you the structure of work we try to publish with the study. And I present now 4 case studies, and the first case is Germany, and for all our case studies we present a kind of context, the context of the welfare state structure. We give some general data, for example, how large is a share of private rental sector, yeah? and Germany is one of the countries with a high share of private rental, and give also some context information about other housing political contexts in Germany, like the strong decrease of public and social and non-profit housing during the last decades. In the second step of our case studies, we try to give an overview in the rent regulation. For example, in Germany, we can differ between 3 phases of rent regulation. In the post-war area, we had this first generation or so-called first generation rent control with a total rent freeze, and the state defined more or less the rent price for new contracts as well as for rent increases. Then we had the period of transition with the gradual abolition of this rent control, but for example in the western part of Berlin, this rent freeze regulation was in practice until 1988, so that we can show that there is a long time of rent control practices in some German cities, but in general since 1975, the rent regulation was more organized in the sense of a second generation rent control, within a comparative rent system, like Sophie presented it also for Berlin in the presentation before. And this means more or less that rent prices from new contracts were unregulated, but there are relative strong rules for rent increases in German cities. So, and then we present some effects we find in other studies on rent control and housing, and for Germany, for example, often reported in the studies that all this rent control resulted in a low interest in investing in rental housing, maintenance investments, and that also there's the findings so that rent regulation resulted in low housing production because there is no private interest to invest into new construction. I'm show you very short that we organized the presentations for our case studies in a similar ways. Also in Sweden, we have a really long history of rent control after the World War II, and also in Sweden we can differ between different phases, so that the mode of rent control changed during the last 50, 60 years. And also in Sweden we found a lot of reports with the findings that rent control lowering the investing activities into rental housing and into housing construction. And if we compare, but in a long time observation, the effects of rent control on housing production, we were very surprised. So that the data show that, for example, here in this should be the case of France, that in the red line, during the time of strong rent control, we had a higher housing production than since the end of the 1980s with very low regulation. And a similar picture is happened for Western Germany. Also during the times of strong rent regulation, we have a higher housing production than in the time with low rent regulation. And also in Sweden, in the long run, we see the same picture. So and for us, against the background of all the studies, explained that rent regulation has an effect on low housing investments. We were a little bit surprised about this finding, and at least we could say that for the argument that rent control lowering the investment in housing construction is not really empirical evident, and we cannot show in these 4 cases so that rent control has a negative impact on housing construction if we have a long-term monitoring and not only a model for 3 or 5 years. The explanation is that housing production, and this is coming back to the points Carme presented in the beginning of our presentation, that housing production depends on much more than on rent price regulation. Yeah, it depends in the case of Germany or France, and also in Sweden, really strong about state intervention, about subsidies, public housing, construction activities. Taxation could be an incentive for investment into housing, so that it becomes for us a clear picture that the results of rent regulation and rent control has to be taken into account, that there are possible other housing political instruments, and so that at least housing political context matter by the explanation of effect of rent regulation. And so I came back to the idea of our study, so that we want to show that the purely economic view is not really adequate to evaluate rent control policies, and therefore we are quite happy that we are invited to this workshop as non-economists, and I wish that this could be a starting point to exchange ideas in an interdisciplinary or more interdisciplinary kind of discussion. So, and time is over, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks a
you.
lot. Thanks a lot. Maybe does somebody have a question? But please short. I mean, I have a comment which I wrote in the chat, is that what you showed is in these pictures, it doesn't take into account many other factors. You have to control for other tendencies that took place simultaneously with this decrease in housing construction. So the fact that during rent control, the housing construction was higher than after the abolition of the rent control doesn't necessarily mean that this is a causal relationship, because in the second period you have completely different factors at play. You have less population growth. The demand for housing has been, to a large extent, already saturated, and therefore you cannot directly compare these two numbers. You have to control for other influences.